All these voices. All these voices. All these things you can't explain. All these painful memories. They keep haunting you and daunting me. It's just a ghost of you and me. It's just a smoking gasoline. It's just a ghost of you and me. Of you and me. All these whispers. All these footsteps in the rain. All these shadows in my mind. From my reflection I can't find. It's just a ghost of you and me. It's just a smoking gasoline. It's just a ghost of you and me. Of you and me. Don't let them take you away. Don't let them bring you down inside. It's just the mirrors in your mind. Don't let them bring you down.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of The Writer's Block. I am your host, horror author James Hershey, and on today's episode we are going to be talking about a very interesting thing that is not very commonly known. Everybody's heard of the Salem witch trials and the witch trials that happened throughout Europe. But a neat little part of these witch trials that nobody ever talks about and most people don't know about is the werewolf witch trials. Yeah, you heard me right. I said the werewolf witch trials. In a lot of these witch trials, there was not only witches being charged and tried, it was also werewolves. Now that might come as a shock to a lot of people, because most people, when they think of a werewolf, they think of a fictional character, something from the movies, something from books. They don't believe that werewolves are real creatures at all. But there's a lot of history behind werewolves that a lot of people don't know about. Werewolfism goes way, way back into history. I mean, way back. And there's all kinds of documented evidence that either werewolves existed or that at least people believed werewolves existed. During the early period, accusations of werewolfism were mixed with accusations of wolf riding or what they call wolf charming. In 1598 there was a case of a man named Peter Stumpp. That really is what led to widespread interest and widespread persecution of suspected werewolves, mostly in like French and German speaking Europe. The werewolf trials reached Estonia in the 17th century, and in Estonia it was a little bit different than it was in Europe, because in Estonia werewolf trials were the most prevalent form of witch trial that happened in that country. There are definite reasons for that, and I will get into that here shortly when I start talking more about Estonia. The place where the werewolf trials lasted the longest was Bavaria and Austria. In those two places, the persecution of wolf charmers and werewolves persisted until after the 1650s. I mean, there was even cases in that area that happened in the early 1700s. So I mean, that's, you know, it's still a long time ago, but it's a lot more modern than you would think. The final cases were recorded in the early 18th century in Carinthia and in Styria. About Estonia, and we're going to talk about Livonia as well. We're going to throw that in with Estonia and the Baltic regions. The reason why werewolf trials were the most prevalent there was because of the peasants, basically. The peasantry in Estonia and in Livonia, they didn't go along with the whole Christian trend that was washing across Europe at the time. Every place in Europe pretty much was turning Christian. And in Estonia and Livonia, the peasantry actually stuck to their old pagan beliefs, and they continued to worship and to do ceremonies and stuff like that in their pagan religions. So because they did not believe in Christianity, they did not believe in Jesus, they did not believe in God, and they did not believe in the devil, they didn't really believe in witchcraft either. There was magic, but it wasn't the same kind of thing that the Europeans believed in. Now, the authorities that be, the Christian church, the nobility, the government, pretty much the entire 17th century, they all were turning Christian. They all believed in the Christian beliefs. And these peasants in Estonia and Livonia, they practiced their religion almost in defiance of all of the authorities and all of the people that ran the show there. Now, they didn't believe in Satan, like I said. And because they didn't believe in Satan, they didn't believe in witches or satanic pacts, because in Europe the belief was that if someone was a witch, that they had made a pact with the devil to gain the magical powers. And so anytime you had witchcraft, it was linked hand in hand with Satanism, basically. And that's what they used to justify the punishment that they gave out to witches. The peasantry did believe in malevolent magic and the existence of werewolves. But they did not associate either one of those two with Satan, like the church did and like all of the authority figures of the time did. The basic result of this was when the Baltic peasantry accused any person of practicing black magic, or they accused them of being werewolves and causing damage to humans or properties or farm animals or something like that, the authorities would interpret this as an accusation of witchcraft and satanic pacts, because that's the way they believed. And what the authorities would do is, when they were trying to get a confession out of the people that were accused, which in itself was a brutal, horrifying thing. I'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. But when they were trying to get their confessions, they would pressure the people that were accused to adjust their confessions to be more in line with the European witchcraft model, so to speak, the European witchcraft trials that were happening throughout Europe. They wanted their confessions to match more whatever everybody else was saying, and not stick to the pagan beliefs that they had. Now, the way they would get these confessions were horrible. I mean, they would basically, somebody would be brought in, and somebody would say, "I think Joe Bob over there is a werewolf, and I think that he turns into a wolf, and he stalks around the countryside, and he eats people's cows and sheep, and he tears up crops, and he hurts people," whatever the accusation is. He does bad things, and that he's a werewolf. So they would take that accusation to the authorities. The authorities would go get the guy and bring him in, basically arrest him. They would take him into the torture chambers, and they would interrogate him, quote unquote. And what this interrogation consisted of was them asking questions like, are you a witch? Are you a werewolf? Did you make a pact with the devil? And of course, the accused person almost 100% of the time would say, "Oh, hell no. I am not a werewolf. I am not a witch. I'm not a devil worshiper. I'm none of those things." But of course, the authorities weren't just going to say, "Oh, okay, well, shit, I guess we got the wrong guy. Go on home and, have some Fruity Pebbles or whatever." That's not the way it worked. They would begin torturing them. They would beat them. They would pull their fingernails off. They would insert little wooden rods underneath the fingernails and slowly drive them in to pop them off. They would burn them with hot metal. They would get a poker or something hot and press it to the flesh and burn them. There was all kinds of horrible things that they would do to these people that were extremely, extremely painful, to get them to confess to the crime of being a werewolf or being a witch. A lot of times both. And of course, after being tortured for a while, almost everybody, the majority of people at least, no matter how tough they were, they would eventually give in and say whatever the hell the people wanted them to say, which, I mean, you really can't blame them. I mean, if put yourself in that position, you're hanging out at your little farm or whatever, somebody comes along and just snatches you up and takes you up to the castle or wherever they go, and they take you down into the torture chambers and they start working you over. They ask you all these questions about being a witch and a werewolf and all this, and of course you're like, oh my god, no, I'm not. You got the wrong guy. I don't do any of that stuff. Please let me go. And they just continue to torture you and torture you and torture you. Eventually you're going to reach the point where the pain is going to be so severe and it's going to suck so bad that you're just going to say, yeah, you know what, you got me. I'm a werewolf, I'm a witch, I run around here, I hurt people, I kill animals, I fly around on a broom, I talk to Satan, I dance naked with him, we party, we hang out, we're boys. Whatever the hell they want to hear, just so the pain stops, the torture stops. You know what I mean? And that's basically what they did. They had at least 18 trials in Estonia between 1527 and 1725. And there was 18 women and there were 13 men that were accused of having caused harm in the shape of a werewolf. After torture, the accused would often confess to have been given their wolf skins by another person or by a demon. And sometimes they would confess to having eaten some particular concoction that would cause them to change. And other times they would say that they had wolf skins that they would put on, and that's what would make them into a werewolf. And they would say that they would hide the wolf skins under a rock or down by the lake or whatever when they weren't using them. In 1636, a woman from Kurna claimed that she was taken into the woods by an old woman and given berries to eat. After she ate those berries, she was transformed into a wolf. And her and the old woman, who had also transformed into a wolf, then began to hunt in the woods. Now that was kind of the normal kind of thing that would come out of this. But it wasn't always a wolf that they turned into. Sometimes people would claim they turned into other animals, such as a bear. There was a person named Gret of Parnau that gave testimony that claimed that while Canty Hans and his spouse turned into wolves, that a woman that they had with them would take the shape of a bear and they would all go off together. Now, this is something that you see in a lot of other cultures as well. Like in Japan and a lot of the Asian countries, they had the whole werewolf kind of phenomenon as well there, but theirs were were-cats. They didn't do the werewolves or the were-bears as much. It was mostly were-cats over there. So you have a lot of different animals that fit into this category of were-something. I mean, the term werewolf is actually a German word, and it basically literally means wolfman. You know what I mean? Man-wolf, wolfman. But there's all kinds of different animals. I mean, you have were-bears, you have were-cats, you have were-lions, you have all kinds of different were-creatures. And were just means man. So if it's a were-bear, it's a bear man. If it's a were-cat, it's a cat man. That's the basic idea here. We're going to get into this a lot more of the history of werewolves and were-creatures after this episode of Writer's Block. We're doing a episode coming up shortly after 11, sometime after that, on Staring into the Abyss. And we're going to cover the entire legend of werewolves and were-creatures. But on this episode, I'm going to basically just talk about the werewolf trials. There was a trial of Hans the werewolf. And that's a typical example of where the werewolf and the witch trials were kind of combined in Estonia. In 1651, Hans was brought before the court, and he was accused of being a werewolf. He was, I think, 18 years old at the time. And after torture, he had confessed that he had hunted as a werewolf for 2 years. And he claimed that he got the body of a wolf from a man in black. Okay? And the judges asked him if his body actually took part in the hunt, or if only his soul was transmuted. So basically what they wanted to know was, did you go from being a man and actually physically change into a werewolf and go out and hunt? Or did your soul leave your body and enter a wolf, and that's how you hunted? Well, Hans said that one time he had found a dog's teeth marks on his leg after he had turned back from being a wolf. So basically from that, the judges decided that he was a human man that transformed into a wolf. His actual body physically changed, because if he got the dog bite as a wolf, then when he turned back into a human, the dog bite was still on his leg. That meant that it was his human body that had transformed. So they said, okay, you're a physical werewolf. And they also said, since you got this power from a quote-unquote man in black, as you say, we are going to decide that the man in black is obviously Satan. That's who it has to be. So, since you got the power to become a werewolf from Satan, that also makes you a witch. So now you're going to be convicted of being a werewolf, and you're going to be convicted of being a witch. So that's what they did. They found him guilty of being a werewolf, and they found him guilty of witchcraft as well. And they sentenced him to death. In the Baltic countries, this was very, very common. This is kind of what they did there. They would take a werewolf trial and they would turn it into a witch trial. Because remember, like I said, in Estonia and Livonia, the Baltic area, they didn't really believe in witchcraft because they didn't believe in Satan or God. They were pagans. But they did believe in werewolves. But the powers that be that did the trials, they did believe in God, because the nobility and all of the European area believed in Christianity at that time. So you had the church that came in that did these trials, and they would turn it from a werewolf trial into a witch trial using that whole man in black idea. Okay, they didn't do that in every case, say it was a man in black, but they always found some little thing that the guy would confess to that they could point to and say, oh, okay, that means it was Satan, and that means you're also a witch, and we're going to kill your ass. That's basically how it worked there. Now, in the Baltic area, the werewolf was kind of a good and a bad thing. In other words, they weren't always considered as evil. There was a notable case in Livonia, which is present-day Latvia, and it happened in 1692. And it kind of followed the same basic pattern as most of them, but it did not end in a death sentence. Okay, there was an 80-year-old guy who confessed to being a werewolf. And he said that he was in a pack with a bunch of other werewolves. And the whole reason that they turned into werewolves was because they would go to hell 3 times a year to fight the witches and the wizards of Satan to ensure a good harvest for the community. Now that sounds absolutely insane, but that is actually from court records of the time. Okay? This guy claims that he was a werewolf and he had other werewolves that hung out with him in a pack, and they actually physically traveled to hell 3 times a year to do battle with witches and wizards, which were sent by Satan to do battle with these werewolves. And if they won, they were ensured a bountiful harvest. That's kind of crazy. Okay, in my mind, and probably in most modern people's minds, you hear that and you think, oh my God, that's nuts. But the reality of the situation is, there were a whole lot of cases like this. You know, not necessarily that they went to hell and fought wizards and witches. That's a little bit strange even for the time, honestly. I'll give you that. But if you look back on the court documents of the time that we have still, I mean, a lot of them have been destroyed. But if you look at what there is actually available to look at, there are a lot of cases that mention werewolves. So that tells you that it's not just a fictional character. It's also a legendary character. Okay? I'm not saying necessarily that it's true, that it's a real creature, but I'm saying that it was recognized by the law as a real creature at that time. People believed at that time that they were real. So in that case, the court tried to make the guy confess that he had made a pact with the devil to become a werewolf. Basically that he was in the service of Satan. And they didn't succeed, because the guy argued. He said, hey, wait a minute. I go to hell to fight Satan. You know what I mean? I fight the witches and the wizards that are sent by Satan. I'm doing battle with Satan 3 times a year to protect my community and make sure we have a good harvest. So I can't be in league with the devil, you know? So this is one of the rare cases where the church actually lost the case. And he was not found guilty of witchcraft, and he was not executed. He was, however, found guilty of werewolfism, and that was a crime as well. And for that crime, he was sentenced to whipping. And his sentence was carried out on October 10th, 1692. Now, you would think whipping as we think whipping now, you know, maybe you just paddle his ass a little bit, smack him around a little, and he gets off, right? That's not how whipping was back then. Whipping back then was pretty severe. I mean, they would take and they would chain your hands to a post so that your back was facing outwards towards, you know, the guy that was going to be whipping you. And then they would take a whip, and this whip could be anything from like a normal bullwhip looking whip all the way to a bullwhip kind of whip that has pieces of metal on the end of it. They used to call them cat of nine tails back in the day. So basically what would happen is these guys would whip you, and every time they would hit you, the metal that is on the end of that whip, and there was multiple of them. It wasn't just one piece of metal. It was several small pieces of metal that came off on their own little lashes of the whip. So the whip would go down and would split and splinter out into many different whips. And when that hits you, it literally just ripped your back apart. It was basically like, if you've ever seen Nightmare on Elm Street, when you see Freddy get somebody with that glove and it rips through their flesh, that's basically what this whip would do. So when they would whip you, it would take flesh. I mean, it would really mess you up. Most times the person didn't die. This guy didn't die. But it would definitely leave a mark and definitely do some damage, and you could not really walk off on your own power after a whipping. They would have to come get you and pull you away, and you'd need medical attention. And so that's what happened to this guy. So that kind of shows you in a way, it's like, yeah, you can win the case, but you're not beating the church anyway. They're going to get you one way or the other, you know? In the Netherlands, whenever you were accused of being a werewolf, almost all the time, they also accused you of being a witch. Because, like I said before, they viewed werewolfism as a satanic ritual. They viewed it as a pact with the devil to get the powers to turn into a werewolf. And so most times when you would have a werewolf trial in the Netherlands, it would turn into a witch trial. So a lot of the witch trials that happened over there in the Netherlands started off as werewolf trials. But when we hear about them today, we only hear about the witch trial aspect of it. But a lot of them actually started as werewolf trials. And it was only because the church decided that that meant the same as witchcraft that they became witch trials. During the witch trials of 1591 to 1595, there were several people that were charged with witchcraft, but only 4 of them were actually executed. One of the ladies committed suicide in prison because the torture was just too much, and she was afraid of what they were going to do to her if she was convicted. And one man actually escaped. He snuck out and got out of there and made a run for it and got away. There was a case of the Dirks who was accused of sorcery, and his daughter and a bunch of his sons were also accused. One of his sons' name was Albert. He was 13 years old, and he testified and claimed that his father and all of his siblings would sometimes turn into wolves, or they would turn into cats. And they were given this power by Satan. And he also testified that they had seen other people who did the same thing. And they all gathered together in a field to dance with the devil. And they would go out together and hunt and kill, you know, farm animals and stuff like that. This testimony was right up the alley of the authorities. That's exactly the kind of thing they wanted to hear. And because of that testimony, they brought his father in and they tortured the hell out of his dad to get him to confess that he had been made a werewolf by Satan, basically, and that he had attacked cattle, and that he had gotten his children to also make a pact with the devil and become werewolves. It kind of began like a domino effect, okay? Because once the son had said that and testified, then they brought the father in and tortured him so that he would confess. And then one of his daughters confessed soon after that she had attended a witch's sabbath as a werewolf. So basically, everybody started confessing because they started torturing one after the other until they confessed. And basically, all of them got executed, except for a couple of the youngest sons. Gilbert and Dirk, 11 and 8, were also spared. The rest were killed. The young children, because of their age, basically, they were spared death. But they had to go through that whole process that I described a minute ago of whipping, where they got chained to the post and got their back laid open. So they didn't get off scot-free, but at least they got to live. There was multiple other trials. In 1595, there was a witch trial in Gelderland, where a guy had confessed to being made a werewolf by the devil, and had a whole pack of people. It's always basically the same story. But what made this guy different? His name was Johan Martinson. Was his name. What made him different was that most times when people were werewolves, they said that they changed into werewolves and they had no memory of what happened. So they didn't know what they did. They were innocent because even though they were werewolves, they had no knowledge or conscious ability to stop what they did as wolves. They didn't know what happened. They had no memory of it. But they were convicted anyway because, they made a pact with the devil, so they needed to die. In this case, and to me, the reason I chose this case to talk about and what made it fascinating to me was that he claimed that when he turned into a werewolf, that he was actually aware of what the wolf was doing. But he claimed that he was unable to speak to warn anybody of what was getting ready to happen, and he was unable to stop the werewolf from doing whatever it was going to do. So basically what he was saying is that he was aware of what was taking place, but he was not in control. It was like he was a passenger in his own body. He was there and he could see everything that was happening, but he had absolutely no control over it, and he had no way to stop it. He ended up being executed, basically. They strangled him and then they burned him afterwards. And that was kind of a thing that happened to werewolves and witches at the end of these trials. The thing that everybody thinks happens to witches at the end of a witch trial is that they're burned at the stake. That's what you always hear. That's the mythology of it. That is what every movie says, what every book says that you read, work of fiction, all of that. It's always, we're going to burn the witches at the stake. But the reality of the situation, when you actually go back and you look at a lot of the actual court documents, and you see the trials, you see what happened, and you see how the executions were done, witches were almost never burned at the stake. That is not a real thing. It didn't happen. What they would usually do with witches is they would hang them. Basically, they would die by strangulation. They would hang them. And they didn't hang them like you see in the Wild West, like you think of in Civil War days, where they climb up onto the gallows, they put the noose around the neck, and they pull the little lever, and the floor drops out, and the person falls, a good 6, 7, 8 feet, and it breaks their neck, and they die almost instantly. That's not how it worked. They would tie the thing around your neck, and they would just hoist you, and it would just strangle you. You would die a slow death of strangulation, kicking and twitching around, tongue rolling out, eyes bulging, all that kind of jazz. Now, a lot of times after they had strangled to death the accused witch or werewolf, then they would burn the body. But it wasn't burning the body to kill the witch or the werewolf. It was, more than anything, burning the body to dispose of the body and just to make sure that it's dead. You know what I mean? After strangling it. But the idea that we all have is that every single witch was burned at the stake. We've all seen the movies where they have the big wooden pole and they tie the woman to the pole, and they have, the little, area around her is filled with sticks and hay and grass and just all kinds of flammable things. And then you have the guy walk up with the torch and he lights it on fire, and the woman standing there at the pole, oh, help me, and she's screaming and all that, you know what I mean? Or she's defiant, whatever. But that's the image that we all have in our minds of the way witches were disposed of. That's just not the way it worked. I mean, there was a couple other ways, throughout history that they killed them as well, but almost all the time it was strangulation. That was the most common. In doing research for this show, I went back and I looked at a lot of documents from the time period, and in absolutely none of them did I find a witch that was burned at the stake. It never happened. At least it's never been recorded or documented in anything I've ever seen that says that happened. Now, did they burn the bodies after the witches were already dead? Yes, a lot of times they did. But that wasn't being burned at the stake. It was a completely different thing. Was there ever a case where a witch was burned at the stake or a werewolf was burned at the stake? Possibly. I can tell you that there was never a recorded case where it's in the actual documentation that I could find. That's not saying that there isn't one, but I never found it. And I looked through everything I could possibly find, and it's just not there. So if it did happen at all, it was a rare thing. It was not the normal way to dispatch of a werewolf or a witch. In the Netherlands, it was a little bit different than in the rest of Europe. Because in the Netherlands, men who were accused of witchcraft were also accused of being werewolves. A lot of the times. Not every time, but a lot of the times. Between 1589 and 1661, there were 6 men that were executed for sorcery. And in half those cases, in 3 of the cases where there were executions, the men were executed only for being werewolves. They were not convicted of witchcraft. They were only convicted of being a werewolf, and they were executed. Now that is different than a lot of the other cases in Europe, especially in the Baltic area, because although being a werewolf was a crime, it was not punishable by execution in most of the areas. It was simply punished by whipping, like I've said multiple times, multiple cases. But in the Netherlands, if you got convicted of being a werewolf, they killed you. So that's a little bit different than the other. The most famous case that took place there was Peter Stumpp. I told you about that one already. In 1598, Jan van Calster was accused of turning into a werewolf and biting 2 kids. But he managed to beat the charges. So he did not give in to the torture, and they couldn't prove anything on him. So he was one of the rare people that actually got acquitted and did not get executed. In 1605, Henry Garden was executed after being accused of being a werewolf, but he was one of the 3 that got accused of being a werewolf and a witch. So he wasn't just the werewolf, he was the werewolf and the witch. And like I said, they often put the 2 together, at least the church did. And that was different than what the people thought from what the government thought. And because basically the church back then was, you might as well say, a form of government. It had the same kind of power that the governments did. Sometimes more, power than the local governments, or even the governments of the country. A lot of times the kings and stuff would have to answer to the church back then. There was also cases where if their wives were accused of witchcraft, okay, then sometimes the husbands would be accused of being werewolves right beside them. That happened in Mechelen. Thomas Batens, Augustus de Moor, they were accused of being werewolves simply because their wives were standing trial for witchcraft. Basically, the wives went through the process of, the torture and the accusations and the interrogations, the whole 9, And in that process, the wife said, hey, our husbands are werewolves. You know what I mean? They kind of threw their husbands under the bus and sold them out. So they brought the husbands in, and they started to work them over to find out what was going on. But the interesting thing about this case, and the reason I bring it up, is because even though the wives kind of threw their husbands under the bus, none of them were convicted. The wives were not convicted, and the two husbands were not convicted. They were acquitted of all charges and set free. So I kind of wonder what happened when they got back home. You know, that time period was not exactly famous or well known for women's rights. A woman just couldn't stand up for herself in the same way she can today. She couldn't, you know, stand up against her husband a lot of times because she would be beaten down. So I wonder what happened to those women once they got home. Were the husbands understanding? Did they say, okay, look, I understand you were being tortured and you said what you had to say to, you know, get them to stop hurting you? Or I wonder if the husbands were pissed because the wife sold them out, so they had to go in and be tortured. Unfortunately, there's no real information on what happened after they left. It just says they were acquitted from the charges. So I'll probably never know that. I'm going to keep looking into it and see if I can find information on what happened, but I doubt I'll be able to find it. But to me, that's just an interesting little question, you know? And that's kind of what happens when I do these things. When I research for these shows, my research always leads me to more questions than I answer. And that's the funny thing about research. And I think that's the amazing and beautiful thing about research, is you might go in trying to find the answer to one single question. But in finding that answer, it leads to 10 other questions. So then you have to look up those questions, and then that leads to more questions. And the next thing you know, you have an amazing amount of knowledge about whatever the subject is, and you learned a lot of really interesting things. I want to talk a little bit about whether or not werewolves are real things. Unless we actually see a werewolf in front of our very eyes, most of us will never truly believe in werewolves. But one thing I've definitely learned through researching this show and all the research I did on werewolves and were-animals in general for the Staring into the Abyss episode that's going to be coming up in a little less than an hour, is that throughout history, people have believed that these things existed. And I don't mean just believed like as in a mythology, like people believe, you know, that if you cross the windshield, if you drive up past a cat, you won't have bad luck. Or the way people believe if you break a mirror, you'll have bad luck. I'm not talking about that little bit of belief. I'm talking about they really believed. They believed to the point that it entered the judicial system. You know, their legal proceedings. There was actual crimes on the books. There was actual laws against being a werewolf or a witch. So that means that not only did these people believe that these things existed, but they believed they existed to the point of they actually made laws about them. Okay? Let's do a modern comparison to that. Okay, a lot of people believe in Bigfoot. And a lot of people don't believe in Bigfoot. But the people that believe in Bigfoot, they don't believe enough to pass a law about Bigfoot. Okay? You don't have nationwide laws saying that you can't kill Bigfoot. You don't have nationwide laws saying that Bigfoots can't do this or can't do that. Or a law against being a Bigfoot. Okay? So imagine the level of belief. Imagine how real these people thought these creatures were during that time period. That there was actual laws against it. And people died. People were brought in, charged, convicted, and executed based on these laws. So, throughout history, people believed that these were real creatures. 100%. there was no doubt that werewolves actually existed and walked among us. In our modern culture, in our modern times, we tend to look back at a lot of these creatures and we laugh about them. We think that werewolves are something only in movies or only in works of fiction. We view vampires the same way. We view a lot of different creatures as simply works of fiction, art. You know, they're not real. That's what we believe now. But you have to think a minute, and you have to really respect the fact that these creatures, werewolves in particular, are not just works of art. They're not just things from movies. They're actually from the history books. They're from criminal cases, court proceedings. They're recognized by governments all over Europe and the United States as being real, living, breathing, dangerous creatures. Now, with our modern sensibilities, we believe that's nonsense. But there's a lot of things that we believe that we've learned aren't true. If you have been on this journey with me throughout the entire, Writer's Block radio show, then you know that I do a lot of different shows. I do shows on history. I do shows on cryptozoological creatures. I do shows on conspiracy theories. I do all kinds of interesting shows. Basically anything that interests me and makes me want to go do research on it and really dig into it and find out the truth. So you've seen, if you've been with me through all this, you've seen multiple cases to where what we thought we believed and knew turns out not to be real. And the truth of the matter is something completely different than what we believe. It's happened over and over and over again. I just recently did a show on historical myths that if you are listening to this right now on the radio live, then you can go to the YouTube channel. It's James Hershey Jr. on YouTube, and you can find that video. It's historical myths, and you can listen to the show I did where I lay out just a whole hour's worth of things that everybody believes is true, but it's just not true. When you actually do the research in history, you find that it's not the real thing. It's completely false. It's a lie we've been told. So there's a lot of stuff like that, okay? And so we have to really stop a minute and think, do we really know? Or are we just kind of lying to ourselves, I mean, keep in mind, we didn't believe that the silverback gorilla was real. That was a mythological creature. That was a cryptic animal until they found them in the Congo. We believed, all of our top scientists believed, that the coelacanth was extinct until one washed up on the coast of Madagascar. And now they know that it's still out there. They thought it went extinct millions of years ago. It was supposedly an animal from the time of the dinosaurs that did not exist anymore. But it's still alive and it's still in our oceans. We believed, all of our scientists, all of our smartest people, all of our reputable people believed that the giant squid was simply a fisherman's tale. That it was the stuff of legends that you had seen drawn on old maps, but it didn't exist in reality. And if you even said, well, maybe it's real because there's all kinds of people that have given reports of this thing throughout history, reputable people. I mean, Christopher Columbus talks about it, for God's sake, on his voyage to the New World. If all these people talked about it, that it was a real creature, how can we just say it's not real? But they would laugh at you and say you were dumb and you were crazy. Until they got it on camera. On a deep submersible sub. They actually filmed it. And then they had one wash up on a beach. So now we know it's a real creature. But we believed that it wasn't. We, with every fiber of our being, said, no, that's not real. It's silly, it's superstition, it's legend, it's mythology, it's garbage. If you believe that, you're a moron. That's what we were told. But now we know that it's real. We're seeing the same thing with mermaids. Mermaids were something that we always believed was just the stuff of fairy tales. And if you even said that mermaids could possibly be real, you were called an idiot, a crazy person, whatever. But now there's footage from a deep water sub of a creature that looks like a humanoid. Now I'm going to tell you, and I will be the first to admit, it does not look like the mermaids that we are used to. Okay? It is not a beautiful, big-breasted woman with flowing, beautiful hair that you want to take home to mama. The only problem with her is she has a fishtail. That is not the mermaid that they caught on the sub, okay? The film footage that they got on the sub is a scary-ass looking creature, okay? It does have a fishy kind of bottom, okay? The top of it does look humanoid. It has arms, it has a head, it has a face, it has hands. Now the hands are webbed, and the face looks almost reptilian in a way. It looks like, I don't know how many of you guys remember a very old show called Land of the Lost. But in that show there were creatures called Sleestaks. That's what the mermaid's face actually looks like, that they caught on the submersible footage. So I'm not saying 100% mermaids exist, but there is some doubt now. There is some footage and we don't know for sure. That might be another thing that ends up in another 5 or 10 years that everybody says, oh yeah, of course mermaids exist. You know what I mean? Dragons are another one. We have reports of dragons throughout history. Every single major culture in the world ever has talked about dragons. It's been in their histories. But if you say dragons are real, you're crazy. But now some of the top scientists and paleontologists are saying, oh wait, you know what? I think dragons were actually real. We are finding fossilized evidence now that most likely they actually existed. Oh, and by the way, sorry about calling you an idiot and a moron and all that. You know? So basically what I'm saying here, I'm not saying that every imaginary thing that you've ever heard of is real. 100% not saying that. What I am saying is don't be so sure. Just because you think something's not real doesn't mean that you're right. Because many, many times throughout history, it turns out that the people from the past knew better than we do. It turns out they're right and we're wrong. See, there's this fascination with our intelligence level as modern humans. We believe that people in the past were somehow inferior to us. They were savages. They weren't as smart as we are. But that belief and that theory, it just simply doesn't hold water. Because just think back. I'll give you one example. And if you really think about it honestly, you'll say, hey, shit, he's right. You know what I mean? He's right. They weren't stupid. Just look back at ancient Egypt. Look at the pyramids. We still, to this day, with modern technology, modern engineering, and modern machinery, we still can't do what they did. We can't do it with modern technology, and they did it with nothing. How? How did they build the pyramids? How did they take stones that weighed over 10 tons each and transport them hundreds of miles from a quarry to the site where they were building the pyramids, and then get them all the way up to the top layers of the pyramids? How the hell did they do that? They didn't have forklifts. They didn't have cranes. They didn't have those things that we have now. So how did they do it? Could a stupid people do that? Could a bunch of savages work out the math to be able to figure out how to do that? How to make pyramids line up with different stars and different constellations. If you do a little bit of research on ancient Egypt, you will find they were pretty amazing. You know? So, basically, the point is, don't be so sure that werewolves aren't real. Don't be so sure that anything isn't real. Because it's very hard to prove a negative. In order to say werewolves do not exist, you would have to look in every single place on the planet. Inside volcanoes, underneath the oceans, at the top of pine trees, over at Uncle Joey's house, down in the bottom of the closet where he keeps his dirty magazines. You got to look over there at Grand Central Station. Make sure you hit that corner stall. Make sure there's not a werewolf in there. You have to look every inch of the planet over. And then when you've done so, you can say, okay, I have absolutely looked everywhere. Werewolves do not exist. That's literally what it would take to prove a negative, to prove that something doesn't exist. All it takes to prove that it does exist is to see one. Now, once again, I'm not saying they're real. I'm not saying they're not. All I'm saying is you never know. And what a boring damn world this would be to live in if none of these mythical creatures ever existed. Wouldn't it be nicer if some of them did? Makes it interesting, doesn't it? That's about all the time I have for this show. Please stay tuned. In less than an hour, we're going to be coming back with Staring into the Abyss, and we're going to be covering the entire legend of the werewolf and were-animals, were-bears, were-cats, all of it. Skinwalkers, shapeshifters, every basic form and way that you could become a werewolf, we'll be talking about. It's going to be a really cool show. That's me and Old Boy. We're going to do that show less than an hour, so please stay tuned for that. Thank you guys so much for listening. Thanks for your support. If you want to check out any of the older shows, they're all on the YouTube channel. Just type in James Hershey Jr. in the search. You can bring up my channel. It's got all the old writer's blocks on there. It's got all the Staring into the Abyss on there, all the shows that we do. You can find them for free on the YouTube channel. Check them out. Enjoy them. Please like the videos and subscribe to the channel. And once again, just thanks for all the support. We love you guys. And until I talk to you again, love many, trust few, and do harm to none. I love you. Bye-bye.